Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into a really interesting slice of American history, roughly 1812 to 1824.
Yeah, it's a fascinating period because it starts off pretty rough, actually. You've got this messy, divisive war.
Right, almost humiliating in some ways?
Exactly. But somehow, out of all that comes this incredible wave of, well, American self-confidence, nationalism, really.
So that's the paradox we want to unpack. We're following the story from, this kind of shaky republic to one that's starting to stand much taller.
And the sources really point to three key building blocks for that transformation. There's Henry Clay's American system,
Okay.
the really contentious Missouri Compromise,
Hmm.
and then the very bold Monroe Doctrine.
Got it. So our mission here is to figure out how this seemingly inconclusive war actually sparked such a major shift in national identity. Okay, let's start with that shaky beginning. The War of 1812. The sources don't exactly paint a picture of eager unity, do they?
No, not at all. This wasn't a war with that burning national anger we saw earlier. The army was, frankly, poorly trained, ill-equipped.
And the generals, I think the source called them semi-senile heirlooms.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Not exactly inspiring leadership at the outset. And that initial strategy, the three-pronged attack on Canada in 1812, total disaster,
Just bogged down.
pretty much.
Yeah.
Historians talk about General Mudd and General Confusion taking over.
Yeah.
The whole thing just collapsed.
But the Navy was a different story, wasn't it? There were some bright spots there.
Absolutely crucial bright spots. American ships, like the famous Constitution Old Ironsides, were often better designed.
Thicker sides, better guns.
Thicker sides, better gunners, larger crews too. And it's interesting, the sources note about 1 in 6 sailors was a free black man. So quite diverse crews. These naval wins were huge for morale.
And the first really big turning point on the water comes in 1813, right? Oliver Hazard Perry.
Yes, on Lake Erie. He captures the whole British fleet and sends back that iconic message. We have met the enemy, and they are ours.
That must have electrified people.
It really did. And it paved the way for General Harrison's victory in the Battle of the Thames soon after, which is also significant because the Shawnee leader Tecumseh was killed there.
Okay, so some successes, but then 1814 hits, and things get really serious again. Napoleon's defeated in Europe.
Right, and that frees up thousands of veteran British troops. They send them across the Atlantic, planning a major invasion down through New York via Lake Champlain. This looked like it could be the knockout blow.
But it wasn't. Thomas MacDonough steps up. Tell us about the Battle of Plattsburgh.
Plattsburgh, September 1814. MacDonough pulls off this incredible, heroic naval victory right there on Lake Champlain. It forces the entire British invasion army to turn back.
Wow. So he basically saved Upper New York.
He did. And it had a huge impact on the peace talks that were already underway.
Yeah.
A really pivotal moment.
But at almost the same time, things are going terribly down south. The British land in the Chesapeake.
Yeah, another British force lands, brushes aside the local militia pretty easily at Bladensburg, and marches right into Washington, D.C.
And they burn it.
They burn the Capitol building and the White House. President Madison, Manny, as the source mentions, has to flee. It's a low point, incredibly humiliating.
Yet even that's followed by a moment of resilience. Baltimore.
Right, the defense of Fort McHenry in Baltimore holds firm against British bombardment. And that's the scene, of course, that inspires Francis Scott Key, who's anxiously watching from a ship, to write The Star-Spangled Banner.
So a real mix of disaster and defiance. And then comes Andrew Jackson, the Battle of New Orleans.
This is the battle that really sticks in the American memory, the emotional peak. January 1815, Jackson's in command. He just crushed the Creek Nation at Horseshoe Bend.
And his force wasn't exactly a polished army.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It was this incredible mix, Army regulars, pirates, Frenchmen, free black volunteers, a real hodgepodge force defending the city.
And the British just attacked head on.
They did. Massively overconfident, launched a frontal assault straight into the American defenses. It was a slaughter. The British lost over 2,000 men in about half an hour. American casualties, around 70. A stunning victory.
Okay, and here's the kicker. The absolutely essential context you need to grasp. This huge morale-boosting victory happened after the peace treaty had already been signed.
2 weeks after, yeah. The Treaty of Ghent was signed on Christmas Eve, 1814. It was basically an armistice, a stop-fighting agreement.
Did it settle anything? The reasons the U.S. went to war?
Nope. It restored conquered territory, but it didn't mention impressment, the trade orders in council, Indian issues. None of it. On paper, it was a draw. Not 1 inch of territory ceded or lost.
But the feeling was different.
Completely different. New Orleans felt like a decisive win. It restored American honor, wiped away the earlier humiliations, and just unleashed this powerful unifying waves of nationalism. That feeling reshaped everything that came next.
And speaking of reshaping things, the first political casualty of this new national mood was the Federalist Party. Tell us about
Yeah.
the Hartford Convention.
Oh, the timing is just politically catastrophic for them. Late 1814, while the war is still technically on, Federalist delegates from New England meet in secret in Hartford, Connecticut. They're airing grievances, talking about secession even, fueled by rumors of illicit trade and helping the British, the Blue Light Federalists.
And it came up with actual demands.
They did. Demands for financial aid for New England,
Yeah.
but also constitutional amendments. Things like needing a two-thirds vote in Congress for an embargo, or to declare war or admit new states.
Trying to limit the power of the South and West.
Exactly. And abolish the Three-Fifths Compromise, limit presidents to one term, prevent successive presidents from the same state, clearly aimed at the Virginia dynasty.
So their representatives head to Washington with these demands.
And they walk into town just as the news of Jackson's incredible victory at New Orleans arrives, along with news of the peace treaty from Ghent.
Oof. Terrible timing.
Couldn't be worse. Their demands suddenly look incredibly petty, even treasonous, given the national mood. It was, as the source says, the death dirge of the Federalist Party. It just faded away after that.
While the Federalists collapsed, who was the clear loser of the war in strategic terms?
Sadly, it was the Native Americans. Tecumseh's dream of a confederacy was gone, and Andrew Jackson used the momentum to force the Treaty of Fort Jackson on the Creek Nation, which was actually illegal, seizing over 20 million acres of their land.
So with the war over and the Federalists fading, this new nationalism starts looking inward, towards culture, the economy.
Right. You see a rise in American literature. Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper start making names for themselves. American textbooks become more common. The influential North American Review starts publication in 1815.
And a general sense of national pride.
Definitely. The Army and Navy are expanded. You get Stephen Decatur's famous toast. Our country. May she always be in the right. But our country, right or wrong. That really captures the mood.
And this focus shifts heavily towards the economy, too, protecting American industries.
Yes, the Tariff of 1816 is a key example. It's the first tariff in U.S. history passed mainly for protection, not revenue. Rates of 20–25% were set to shield those new war baby factories, the industries that popped up during the war, from being swamped by cheap British goods dumping, as they called it.
Which leads us straight to Henry Clay and his big idea, the American system. What was this plan all about?
Clay envisioned this integrated, profitable home market. It had three main parts. First, a strong national bank. The second Bank of the United States was chartered in 1816 to provide stable currency and credit.
Okay, the bank. What else?
Second, that protective tariff we just mentioned to foster American manufacturing. And third, a network of federally funded roads and canals, internal improvements paid for by the tariff revenues.
Why were roads and canals so important?
Well, the war had shown how bad transportation was, especially trying to move troops and supplies, particularly out west. Clay saw infrastructure as crucial for tying the agricultural west to the manufacturing east.
Makes sense. So did the whole system get implemented? Bank, tariff, and infrastructure.
Well, 2 out of 3 wasn't bad. The bank and the tariff passed. But the federal funding for roads and canals, that hit a snag.
Why? What happened?
President Madison, just before he left office in 1817, actually vetoed a major bill allocating $1.5 million for internal improvements. He argued the Constitution didn't explicitly authorize federal spending on infrastructure like that.
So states were left to handle it.
Pretty much. New England also opposed it, fearing it would drain their population westward. So projects like New York's massive Erie Canal, completed in 1825, had to be undertaken by the states themselves.
Interesting. Now, all this is happening during James Monroe's presidency, which started in 1816. And his time in office gets called the era of good feelings. Accurate label?
Mostly not. It's a famous misnomer, as the source calls it.
Yeah.
Yes, the Federalist Party was gone, so overt party conflict was low. Monroe himself was popular, a kind of transitional figure.
The last president to wear a cocked hat, right? Linking generations.
Exactly. But beneath the surface, the period was actually pretty troubled. There were intense debates over the tariffs, the bank, internal improvements, and, crucially, the growing issue of slavery.
And it wasn't all good feelings economically either, was it? The Panic of 1819.
Definitely not. This was the first major financial panic the country had faced since Washington's time. a real shock to the system.
What caused it?
Primarily, rampant overspeculation in frontier lands. People borrowed heavily to buy land out west. Banks lent too freely. Then the bubble burst.
And the Bank of the United States took the blame.
It did, especially in the West. When the bank had to foreclose on farms and properties, it became seen as this heartless financial devil. This panic-fueled resentment against banks and creditors, planting seeds for Andrew Jackson's future political movement. It also increased calls to end debtors' prisons.
And speaking of the West, you mentioned land speculation. There was a huge movement westward during this time, right?
Absolutely explosive growth. 9 new frontier states joined the Union between the original 13 and 1819.
What drove that? Just cheap land.
Cheap land was a big part of it. The Ohio fever. Plus, European immigration picked up after the Napoleonic Wars. Tobacco farming was exhausting the soil in older states. Harrison and Jackson had largely broken Native American power in key areas.
And transportation was improving somewhat.
Slowly. The Cumberland Road started construction in 1811. Steamboats began appearing on western waters the same year. The West demanded, and got, cheaper land too. The Land Act of 1820 allowed buying 80 acres for just $1.25 an acre cash.
Okay, so this massive westward expansion inevitably brings the slavery issue right back to the forefront. Missouri.
Exactly, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The territory of Missouri applies for statehood, and it wants to come in as a slave state.
And that was a problem because...
Because it threatened to upset the delicate balance in the Senate. At the time, there were exactly 11 free states and 11 slave states. Admitting Missouri as slave would tilt the balance of power towards the South.
And the North tried to stop it.
Yes, with the Tallmadge Amendment. It proposed prohibiting any more enslaved people from being brought into Missouri and gradually emancipating the children born to those already there.
How did the South react to that?
They saw it as a profound threat, an ominous threat, the source says. If Congress could restrict slavery in a new state, could it interfere with slavery in the existing southern states? It was a major confrontation.
So Henry Clay, the great compromiser, steps in again.
He does. He brokers this delicate 3-part compromise. First, Missouri is admitted as a slave state.
Okay.
Second, to keep the balance, Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts, is admitted as a separate free state. So it's 12-12 in the Senate.
And the third part, this is the crucial one for the future, right?
Absolutely. Slavery was prohibited in all the reigning territory of the Louisiana Purchase, north of the southern boundary of Missouri. The line 36 degrees, 30 minutes.
So a line drawn across the continent, basically. Slavery allowed below it, banned above it in that territory.
Precisely. It cooled things down for a while, about 34 years. But nobody thought it solved the underlying problem.
Thomas Jefferson's reaction was pretty stark, wasn't it?
He called it a fire bell in the night, warning it could mean the end of the Union. John Quincy Adams called it just a title page to a great tragic volume. They knew this issue wasn't going away.
While Congress is wrestling with this sectional crisis, the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall is busy strengthening the federal government's power.
Very much so. The Marshall Court consistently issued rulings that boosted federal authority over the states and protected property rights. It was a key part of this nationalist surge.
We should probably hit a couple of the really big cases. First, McCulloch v. Maryland in 1819. Why is this one so foundational?
It's huge. The court upheld the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States, even though a national bank isn't explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. Marshall used the doctrine of implied powers, loose construction.
And it also dealt with states taxing the bank.
Right. Maryland tried to tax the Baltimore branch of the BUS. Marshall slapped that down, declaring emphatically that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. States couldn't undermine legitimate federal institutions. Massive win for national power.
Okay, and another key one is Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824, the steamboat case.
Yes. This case involved a steamboat monopoly granted by New York State. Marshall ruled that only Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce.
So, striking down the state monopoly.
Exactly. This decision broke down state-level barriers to trade and transportation, clearing the way for the development of national markets and economic networks. It really underpinned Clay's vision, legally speaking.
And there were other cases, too, like Fletcher v. Peck and Dartmouth College v. Woodward, that protected contracts and property rights from state interference.
Correct. Marshall consistently interpreted the Constitution in ways that favored a strong, centralized government and protected business interests. He really shaped the legal landscape for decades. Daniel Webster, by the way, argued for Dartmouth in that case.
So the court is providing the legal backbone for nationalism. And this growing national confidence also starts showing up in foreign policy, right? Defining borders, asserting influence.
Definitely. And Secretary of State John Quincy Adams is central to this. First, there's the Anglo-American Convention of 1818 with Britain.
What did that settle?
It allowed Americans to share the Newfoundland fisheries. It fixed the northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase along the 49th parallel all the way to the Rocky Mountains. And it established a 10-year joint occupation of the Oregon country. Practical, clear definitions.
And then Florida. How did the U.S. acquire Florida? It wasn't exactly a clean process.
No, it was pretty aggressive. Andrew Jackson again. In 1818, claiming he was chasing Seminoles and runaway slaves, he marched into Spanish Florida, seized Spanish forts, and even executed 2 British subjects he accused of helping the Seminoles.
Did he have orders to do all that?
No, he way exceeded his instructions. It caused a diplomatic uproar. But John Quincy Adams, a staunch nationalist, defended Jackson's actions.
He basically told Spain, control Florida or sell it.
Pretty much. Spain realized it couldn't effectively govern Florida and was dealing with revolutions in Latin America anyway. So, in the adams-onistreaty of 1819, Spain ceded Florida to the U.S. and also gave up its claims to Oregon. In return, the U.S. gave up its somewhat shaky claims to Texas.
Okay, so consolidating territory. And this confidence culminates in the big one, the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. What was the background here? Why issue this statement?
There were a couple of factors. In Europe, the conservative monarchs were putting down liberal revolutions. There were rumors they might try to help Spain regain its lost colonies in the Americas.
And Russia was making moves too.
Yeah, Russia was pushing south from Alaska down the Pacific coast, claiming territory down to the 51st parallel, encroaching on the Oregon country claims.
Britain actually suggested the U.S. and U.K. issue a joint warning against European intervention, didn't they? Why did Adams say no?
Adams was suspicious. He thought it would make the U.S. look like, in his words, a small cockboat, trailing behind the powerful British man of war. He felt it was more dignified for the U.S. to make its own statement.
Did he think Britain would block intervention anyway?
Yes. He correctly figured the British Navy would prevent other European powers from intervening, mainly to protect Britain's own valuable trade links with the newly independent Latin American republics. They didn't need a formal alliance for that.
So Monroe goes it alone. What did the doctrine delivered in his annual message in December 1823 actually say? 2 main points.
2 key principles. First, non-colonization. The Americas were no longer open to further colonization by European powers. This was aimed largely at Russia.
And second,
Non-intervention. European nations should not interfere with the existing independent republics in the Western Hemisphere. Essentially, keep your monarchical systems out of our neighborhood.
so a pretty bold statement for a relatively young nation.
Extremely bold. It's really an expression of that post-1812 nationalism and growing self-confidence. Sometimes it's called the self-defense doctrine.
How was it received at the time?
European monarchs were annoyed, but they couldn't do much about it, largely because the British Navy implicitly backed it up for its own reasons. Latin American nations didn't pay it much mind initially, but Russia did agree in 1824 to limit its claims to the line of 54 degrees 40 minutes.
And long-term, it became a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy, reinforcing this idea of American isolationism, even if it was initially dependent on British power.
Precisely. It deepened that illusion of the U.S. being separate from European affairs, even as it asserted dominance in its own hemisphere.
So, wrapping up this period, 1812 to 1824, we go from a divisive war to a surge of nationalism that reshapes politics, tries to reshape the economy via the American system, strengthens federal power through the judiciary, and boldly defines America's place in the world with the Monroe Doctrine.
It's a remarkable transformation in a fairly short span of time. The war itself was messy, but the outcome in terms of national feeling and direction was profound.
Okay, here's a final thought to leave our listeners with. We talked about how the political side of Clay's American system, specifically the federal funding for internal improvements, stalled because of constitutional objections and political divisions.
Right. Madison's veto was a big setback for that part of the plan.
But think about the Marshall Court's decisions we discussed, McCulloch, Gibbons. Didn't the Supreme Court, in a way, provide the legal and economic infrastructure for Clay's vision, even if Congress couldn't fund the physical infrastructure? By asserting federal power over banking and interstate commerce, wasn't the court creating the framework for a unified national economy that Clay wanted?
That's a fantastic point. Yeah, while the legislative branch balked at building the roads and canals, the judicial branch was busy removing the legal barriers and establishing the federal supremacy needed for a national market to flourish. The court kind of picked up the nationalist ball that Congress dropped, in a sense.
An interesting example of how different branches can drive a national agenda even when they're not perfectly aligned. A really fascinating period. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We'll catch you next time.